Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this IIF ESG webinar. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy. This new webinar series is designed to promote understanding of the rapidly evolving landscape for ESG disclosure and help with alignment of efforts to measure and track climate finance. We've been looking at different regulatory and policy initiatives, disclosure frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and different methodologies for measuring and reporting climate risk and portfolio alignment. So joining us for today's discussion, I'm really pleased to introduce Nate Aydin, who is Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, or WRI, and the Science Based Targets Initiative. I will open up with a few quick questions for Nate, after which he'll tell us more about science-based targets framework for financial institutions and update us on some of their ongoing projects. After Nate's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where you can submit questions via the Q&A function, and feel free to do so at any time. We'll get them all teed up. And we'll get to as many questions as we can, but we'll stick firmly to half an hour for this call. Just a few housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to remind you that our discussion is on the record and press is in attendance. We're recording and it'll be available on our website afterwards. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. And Nate, first of all, tell us, where are you joining us from today and how has your work at home experience been going?
Thank you very much, Sonja. And I'm actually joining you from Stockholm, Sweden today. And it's a different experience here in Sweden. Each country is taking a different approach to the situation. But we'll see how it goes in the long run. So yeah, happy to be here and hope that everyone is healthy and safe.
And we're delighted to have you join us. But okay, science-based targets. Tell us a little bit about these. Why do we need science-based targets for cutting emissions? And what good does it do me to have these targets if I'm a financial firm?
Yeah, thank you, Sonja. So far we've had 870 companies and financial institutions join the Science-Based Targets Initiative and publicly commit to setting a science-based target. And they have a range of business cases for doing this. The main one is to really future-proof their growth and to avoid getting stuck with stranded assets as we shift to a low-carbon economy, and to ensure that they are aligning with the Paris Agreement, not only in long-term 2050 terms, but also in the next 5 to 15 years. And to ensure that they are on the right path there. And so this initiative really provides a very transparent and robust framework for companies and financial institutions to set targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And now we offer additional information in terms of whether the target that they set is 2-degree aligned, well below 2-degree aligned, or 1.5-degree aligned. So there's a lot of information that participants get in the initiative. It's of course completely voluntary. And so at this point, this is really a global leadership platform that can inform these organizations' peers, they can inform the staff of the organizations, and they also inform policymakers and various governments in terms of demonstrating that this is not only possible, but a competitive gesture and action for many of these companies and financial institutions to increase their ability to prosper under a low carbon transition.
Mm. Well, that's really helpful color, and a question that I know we've had and will continue to get. Okay, so here we are all on lockdown and CO2 emissions are maybe going to fall 7.5% in the US this year. And I read some statistic in Europe, daily emissions are down by 50%. So are we there yet? And how does this compare with what we need to do for Paris?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. The current circumstances are not the desired way to mitigate emissions. One of the basic premises of the SBT initiative is that we're able to reduce emissions while continuing to thrive economically and continue producing and growing new business models. So insofar as there are some companies benefiting from people staying at home and social distancing, that's consistent, but the general destruction of demand here is not really the approach of the SBT initiative. It's more shifting so that it can be low carbon growth through decarbonization, and through energy efficiency improvements and through new business models that are less emissions intensive. In terms of the emission reduction pathways, 8% reduction in 1 year is certainly unprecedented and unexpected in any of our models. It is the kind of emission reduction pathway that leads to rapid stabilization. And it's the kind of level of ambition that is talked about in IPC scenarios, for example, as being a 1.5 degree level of stabilization. So recently, the EU has bandied about a 7% annual reduction requirement for 1.5 degree pathways. That's a little bit conflating absolute reduction, so the actual reduction in emissions every year, with economic intensity approach, which puts an economic denominator under that. And that adds a lot of uncertainty when you have that economic denominator. But in any case, this ambition is quite high, and it's actually higher than what we require with the companies that are 1.5 degree aligned. In that case, the minimum absolute contraction is 4.5% per year on a linear basis. And I'm happy to elaborate on some of those criteria in my presentation here. But what we're seeing now is well beyond anything that anyone expected, and certainly beyond anything that is required or pushed in the SBT initiative at this point. So it's it could be a historical inflection point if we can build back better and use science-based targets as a way of guiding the restructuring of our economy, so that we're not doing the same rebound that we did 12 years ago with the financial crisis, where there was a temporary dip of less than 2% emissions, which we considered big back then. And then we came back even stronger. And if you look at sort of the trend over the years, there was no reduction, cumulatively over a 5-year period. We're hoping that that's not the case here. And that's one of the roles of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, is to guide companies as they do perhaps receive stimulus or think about, regrowing their business and their demand, to show sort of what that looks like among their peers and among different sectors in terms of reducing emissions while continuing to produce and thrive economically. And so it's an interesting time. It could be an inflection point, and we're hoping that, especially for financial institutions, there will be some important opportunities for supporting increased climate mitigation ambition through science-based targets for their investment and lending portfolios.
Thank you. Yes, you make a great point on the need for building back better. So on that note, I think you've got a number of interesting slides to share with the group, and I will just remind people to go ahead and submit questions as we go along.
I will just be giving a fairly high-level overview of the framework that we're developing for financial institutions to set science-based targets that also cover their investment and lending portfolios. So Sonia already mentioned that this is being recorded. So in terms of what science-based targets are, basically we at WRI and among the other Science-Based Targets Initiative core partners, who are CDP, WWF, UN Global Compact, and WRI, we're all being approached by companies that were happy to talk about 2050 targets and their 2050 alignment with the Paris Agreement, but there's really a lack of accountability with that type of target, insofar as the staff that are setting it will likely be retired at that point, and that there's a real need for near-term action before 2050. And so one of the reasons that we set this initiative up was to show the next 5 to 15 year pathway for companies and financial institutions to meet those longer term goals. And so that's one of the key components of science-based targets. It also breaks the global scenarios down to the company or financial institution level, as opposed to just keeping it global or sector-wide. So the basic purpose of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to support private sector mitigation ambition and helping companies and financial institutions align with the Paris Agreement on that company or financial institution level. And we have a 3-pillar strategy that we use for doing that. The first is around reducing the barriers to the adoption of science-based targets. So we've created this new sector decarbonization approach method, which is leveraging the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Perspectives series of scenarios and publications. And the benefit there is that it breaks the emissions pathways down to a subsector level, for example, steel production or aluminum production, et cetera. The second is a set of methods and tools that we have put on our project website that help to reduce these barriers. And the second pillar is to institutionalize the adoption of these targets through amplifying the companies that are doing this, but also producing a manual of sort of how to set science-based targets within a C-suite and how to develop them and implement them. And the third pillar is to create a critical mass of companies and financial institutions. And so we launched this 5 years ago now. And the idea here is that we're trying to get to the leading companies and financial institutions globally that want to set a target and want to align it with the Paris Agreement. So at this point, we now have 870 companies and financial institutions that have publicly committed to setting the science-based targets, of which 360 have targets that have been submitted to the SBT initiative and approved and met our criteria. At this point, we're having 3 to 5 companies and financial institutions joining per week. So in terms of the difference between these two groups of 870 committed and 360 approved, the difference is that those 360 have met our criteria. So we have 5 high-level criteria that we use to assess these voluntary submissions to the SBT initiative. These are for companies at this point, so some background for you. So the first is the boundary of the target. It has to cover all of the greenhouse gas emissions, both in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also in terms of different greenhouse gases. So not just carbon or methane, but all 7 Kyoto gases. The second is the time frame that I mentioned earlier. It has to be 5 to 15 years from the date of announcement. And the logic there is that there were many groups, companies, financial institutions happy to talk about 2050, but that there's a lack of accountability there. And so this is a 10-year window that's actionable, but still accountable for the staff that are setting the target. The third is the level of ambition of the target. And this, when we started the initiative and the call to action 5 years ago, it was 2 degrees. After the 2018 IPCC report on 1.5, we increased the minimum ambition to well below 2 degrees, so roughly 1.7. And that's for that scope 1 and 2 target. As I said, we differentiate between the existing 360 approved targets, whether they are 2 degree aligned, well below 2 degree aligned, or 1.5 degree aligned. The fourth criteria is really the crux of the criteria and the initiative. And what this says is that companies have to have a scope 3 inventory. This also applies to financial institutions. And if scope 3 is greater than 40% of aggregate scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, they have to have a separate, ambitious, and measurable scope 3 target. And for financial institutions, this is always the case. So they always have to have a separate, ambitious, and measurable scope 3 target. And this is more or less complicated depending on where the company is in the supply chain. Many of the companies that have initially joined the initiative were brands or retailers. And so they had large category 1 emissions from purchased goods and services from their supply chain. And so they have had to engage their suppliers to set their own targets. And this has been a signal achievement of the SBT initiative to get companies and financial institutions to not only quantify their scope 3 emissions, but actually address them through these targets. Then the fifth sort of high-level criteria is that once the target is publicly set, they have to have public disclosure of their emissions inventory. in order to be able to be assessed as to whether they're on the pathway to achieving their target or not. And this assessment isn't something that the SBT initiative presently does, but the SBT initiative is part of a broader ecosystem, and there are other stakeholders that do that type of tracking and assessment. So that's some background that mostly covers the companies that we've been dealing with in the previous 5 years. One of the biggest growth areas for us has been among financial institutions. And so now we launched this project 2 years ago in order to develop a framework for financial institutions to set targets for their investment and lending portfolios. And that's what I'll be describing here. At this point, we have a group of 54 financial institutions that you can see listed here on the screen that have publicly committed to setting science-based targets. I'd say this is sort of the tip of the iceberg in the sense that these are sort of the brave financial institutions that have publicly committed before we've even finalized the framework. There are numerous other financial institutions that have been involved with this process and are also indicating that they will be submitting targets as well once we finalize the framework. In terms of the project, the World Resources Institute, where I work, is the managing partner for this particular project, but we work closely with CDP and WWF on this particular project. And we also work together with Navigate, which has recently been acquired by Guidehouse, as a technical sort of supporting partner. The basic theory of change with this work is similar to the Science-Based Targets Initiative more broadly, where we're thinking in terms of tipping points. And our experience here is that once we hit about 20% of a particular sector or group, then those early innovators and adopters tend to really influence their peers strongly and sort of pull them in. And it's a unique relationship and voice that certainly NGOs don't have, but even policymakers don't have that same type of influence. And it can be especially compelling if it's a purchaser relationship where the purchaser is looking for particular characteristics in their suppliers. And so this is a similar approach that we're taking with financial institutions in terms of taking this holistic perspective and trying to come up with criteria that really are able to capture that leading component of the sector from different angles. So in terms of what we include here, we do include scope 1 and 2 methods, scope 3 methods. We are going beyond what we do with companies insofar as we're planning to require disclosure of implementation strategies. With companies, they simply have to say how much they're reducing emissions, but with financial institutions, there's seen to be a need to actually explain how they plan to achieve those emission reductions. We do include flexibility in terms of what actions they take. It's not prescriptive, it's not promoting particular technologies. And we do include engagement strategies via portfolio coverage and our new temperature scoring method. We do not include impact assessment, additionality, ex post tracking ourselves, implementation requirements of exactly what they need to do, leakage remediation, or evaluation of strategies' cost effectiveness. There are other complementary groups and initiatives out there that do some of this work, and we're not trying to do everything all at once, and we hope that we can be complementary with some of these other groups that are out there, but we want to be clear so that expectations are adjusted accordingly of what we're trying to cover and what we're not trying to cover here. The framework that we're developing this year has 4 components that you can see here on the screen. So the first is a group of 4 methods that we road tested last year, and those are sort of the foundation for setting targets for investment and lending portfolios. The second is a set of criteria that we just are in the process of finishing a feedback period on. And it's sort of a financial sector version of those 5 high-level criteria that I mentioned earlier, but they're very focused on the scope 3 component, which is really the complicated aspect here. Then we're developing a target setting tool, and we're just starting that process with a technical developer. And then finally, we have a guidance document, which will sort of bring all of this together and explain sort of a how-to and include case studies of how different methods are being applied to different types of financial institutions, whether they're investors, asset managers, universal banks, asset owners, etc. In terms of the methods themselves, we've mapped them to particular asset classes. So at this point, we're focusing on real estate, mortgages, electricity generation, project finance. With those, we're all doing this physical intensity approach that I mentioned, which leverages the IEA work with the ETP. And then for corporate instruments, so that's equity, bonds, debt, we use 4 different methods. So the first is the physical intensity method, where there is a linkage with a particular emissions intensive subsector. Let's say they have steel plants in their portfolio. The second would be more of a capacity-based approach. And then the third is what we call portfolio coverage, which is the idea that the investor engages their investees to set their own science-based targets. That's a relatively simplistic approach, but it's one that we're exploring here. And then the fourth is a new one that we're just introducing, which is doing temperature rating of the companies and the portfolio overall, and having a temperature rating in the base year of the financial institution, and then setting a target for 5 to 10 years from now of what the temperature rating will be by shifting the actions of the components, the companies in the portfolio. Here's an overview of the milestones of the project. So as I mentioned, we did some method road testing last year, and we're just in the process of finalizing the criteria, of summarizing the feedback that we've gotten on the criteria. And we will have a workshop in a couple of weeks to share the feedback that we've got on the criteria and the next steps there. We'll be beta testing this new tool that we're developing this summer, and then we're going to launch the framework in September. In terms of opportunities for participation from IFF members and others, I've grouped them into 3 groups here on the screen. So within the SBTI finance framework, we have a general stakeholder informational email list that all of you are welcome to join. The second is this webinar in a couple of weeks that I mentioned. We'll be sharing the feedback on the criteria that we've been developing so far. We will be sharing a draft of the guidance and welcoming review of that. And then, of course, joining that list of more than 50 financial institutions that have publicly committed to setting a science-based target is an option. And once the framework is published in September, actually submitting a target is the endpoint here. And so far as we're looking forward to having financial institutions with those approved science-based targets to start to define best practices for different types of financial institutions and asset classes. In terms of the temperature alignment method, we had a webinar last week, which is available on our project website. And that was launching a review process for that new method. That'll be open for the next couple of weeks, and we would welcome feedback on that. And then finally, for this tool development process that I mentioned, we are eager to incorporate users, that is financial institutions, into the tool development process. So there are really 3 opportunities here. The first is to join the user development group, and we'll start to convene that next week with the tool developer that we're working with. The second is for data and service providers, to work closely with them, because as I'm sure all of you know, there's a range of data and service provider options out there, and the data can vary quite a bit across different providers. And part of our goal here is to harmonize this and to make a more consistent field to avoid any potential inconsistencies across different providers and to add some transparency and open source aspects here. And then finally, all financial institutions are welcome to join our beta testing that we'll be doing this summer of the tool itself and to apply it to your actual portfolio and come up with a temperature alignment of your portfolio. And that's something that we'll be sharing via the list that I mentioned. So now I'll just go to open this up for a few minutes of questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nate. That was very helpful. So we've had a number of questions come through, some of which we'll probably have to go through to you bilaterally. But Some of them are concerning scope 3 emissions in particular. Now, clearly this is, as you mentioned, very complex and a big part of financial firms' emissions that they need to take into account. Can you give some color around that across different sectors? How big a proportion are scope 3 emissions? And the question, yeah, go ahead.
So I'd say with about 70% of our company targets that we have with real economy companies, they have scope 3 emissions that are greater than 40% of their aggregate scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so they have separate scope 3 targets. Calibrating that ambition for companies has been an ongoing process that is really, we don't have the same level of rigor there that we do for the scope 1 and 2 targets. So it doesn't have to be well below 2 degree scope 3 target, simply because a lot of these companies don't have that level of control over their scope 3 emissions, especially where it's upstream emissions and they're purchasing so many inputs that are very emissions intensive. For example, apparel and footwear companies tend to have very large scope 3 emissions, and they don't always know where they come from in terms of they have up to 5 tiers of suppliers. And so it's an iterative process to really get to the big scope 1 emitters there. And we have set up flexible scope 3 guidance here in order to drive ambition, but still allow for these companies to be able to do something and to have an approved, transparent, robust target. With financial institutions, it's a whole nother level of difficulty because you have generally 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. Category 1 through 14 are purchased goods and services, use of sold product, employee commuting, things like this, which are, that can be more or less difficult to quantify, but relatively straightforward. And then you have category 15, which is financed emissions, which are a whole nother can of worms. And so one reason we're taking this asset class-based approach is to focus on where we have more tangible, robust linkages initially, and not just take on the entire portfolio, all financed emissions all at once, with the understanding that there are legitimate data and methodological challenges around financed emissions quantification. And so this is part of the approach that we're taking, and it's addressed in the criteria that I mentioned as well.
So we'll have you back for a special webinar just on financed emissions.
Yeah, for sure.
But one last question here. So this, for financial institutions, they note, this question notes, we don't have ownership over client portfolios under ERISA law, we're just advisors. So does scope 3 has to be on their own proprietary accounts, and do your criteria take that into account?
Yeah, so, we are working with a range of different types of financial institutions, asset owners, asset managers, universal banks, and there are diverse relationships here. Generally, we're trying to come up with criteria that are unique for each group and that provide some flexibility and accommodate those different legal frameworks for different types of financial institutions and not unrealistically pressure them or exaggerate their leverage over their clients. But we do have some engagement type of approaches and methods which we think can apply in that situation, and that we have been road testing and including in our criteria that we hope can address that situation. But happy to follow up with all of your members as well around those questions. And thank you for the excellent questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Nate. I'm afraid we have to leave it at that. That's Nate Aydin from Science Based Targets Initiative and World Resources Institute. So please feel free to get in touch with Nate with further questions and follow up. And thank you all for being with us today. The replay will be on our website, and we look forward to seeing you at future ESG webinars. Thank you.